If you're one that drugs and alcohol define you, I want you to know there is hope. 13 years that I've been doing this, I've treated tens of thousands of people. I've seen lots of people get better from this disease. My name is Rob Norris. I'm a division president at Summit Behavioral Healthcare. Got into the treatment of substance use disorder through personal experience. Grew up in an alcoholic home, was an alcoholic, married an alcoholic, studied alcoholism, and now I treat it. I started by just wanting to fit in. It ended up I'm having fun. It started to define me. I couldn't stop, but yet I didn't know of a way out. And finally I woke up one morning and I just, my mom came running into the room and said, what are you doing? And I just opened my mouth and God said, I need help. And so I did, and then, I got out of treatment and came to church that following Sunday at Parker Hill, and Mark Stenzi was discussing the invisible war. And, I'd put every drug in my body, and I'd never felt anything like what I felt that morning when the Holy Spirit, entered me. And it's like, man, I'm never leaving, never leaving this place. I see very smart, well-raised individuals suffering from addiction and just can't stop. It's not a choice. The American Medical Association has deemed addiction a disease. It's progressive, it's contagious, it's fatal. When people ask me, as a father, do you love your kids? Well, yeah, I love them to death. But when you're talking about an addict or an alcoholic, somebody suffering from substance use disorder, you've got to change that way of thinking. You've got to look at it as, I want to love them to live. Encourage them, yet not enable them. The more you cushion their blows, the longer the addiction is going to continue. My opinion, and reading the research and doing this for so long, it's a spiritual disease. It's a spiritual malady. The common thread that I saw with this is that they were all trying to fill a void. I haven't found a pill, and nor do I think they ever will make a pill that will address the spiritual void that the alcoholic and the addict is trying to fill with the drugs and alcohol. The treatment of substance use disorder, because it's so multifaceted, we need to come at it from all those sides as well. Should involve some, physical medicines, get you through the cravings, the withdrawal, make sure you're safe. The emotional side, we need to address any kind of co-occurring issues you may have, or that may be as a result of your drug and alcohol use, high anxiety, depression, the guilt, the shame, the remorse. You need to be aware that there is a spiritual component to this disease. A spiritual disease needs a spiritual solution. And God's the answer. Ultimately, it takes, you taking the first step and saying, I've got an issue and I want a way out. It's not easy, but you're worth it. When I first entered into this, phase of recovery, it was difficult. I was scared, and I never admitted I was scared before. And it just took a little bit of work and a little bit of faith, and I know through my personal and professional experience that there is hope out there. And maybe it's time for you to take that step.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's great to have you guys here today. And today we are beginning a new teaching series. It's called Escape. And for the next few weeks, we're going to be talking about a very difficult issue, but a very important issue in our culture today. Because if you're at all aware, at all connected to the culture today, you know that we are in the middle of what many people are calling a national crisis when it comes to addiction. That hardly a week goes by when you don't read a news story or watch something on TV or see something online about the addiction problem in our culture today. And the statistics on this are startling. For example, the number of people who died last year, 1 year in the U.S. from drug overdoses, is more than the U.S. casualties in the Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq wars combined. We lose more people to drug overdoses in 1 year in this country than we lost in 3 wars. And one of the biggest problems is that it begins at a very young age. If you're in high school, pay attention to this. 92% of those with an addiction began drinking, smoking, or using illegal drugs before the age of 18. You begin to develop these habit patterns very young in life and spend the rest of your life trying to undo it. One of the biggest issues today is prescription painkillers. Listen to this. 240 million prescriptions were written for legal opioids in the U.S. last year. How much is that? More than enough for every adult to have their own bottle. It's flooded our culture. And here's where that leads. 80% of heroin addicts, 80%, started with prescription opioid medications. Those are the statistics. And those statistics are staggering. But the real pain of addiction isn't something you feel when you read statistics. The real pain of addiction is something that you feel in your life and in the lives of people that you care about. This is a somewhat personal issue for me. I have a brother who's about a year younger than me. He's an adopted brother, and at the age of 20, he became an alcoholic. Then that developed into a drug addiction, and he's gone through long seasons of his life where he's been homeless. About 6 years ago, we lost track of him. We're not sure where he is. We think he's somewhere on the West Coast. As far as I know, my brother is still living, but the truth is we lost him 35 years ago. We lost him to an addiction. And I'll bet I'm not the only one. Just by a raise of hands, how many of you have a friend or a family member who has ever struggled with addiction? Just go ahead and raise your hand. Okay, look around the room. This is why we talk about a subject like this. But here's the first thing I want you to know about addiction, about any habits in your life, any struggles that you have. There's one message that we want you to hear loud and clear over the next few weeks, and it's a message of hope. There is hope. In fact, 2,000 years ago, when Jesus invaded human history, stepped onto this earth, the first time that he stood to speak publicly and gave what we would call today a sermon, here's how he began. He said, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners." So if you've ever struggled with an addiction, you are the very person that Jesus came here for. He came here to set prisoners free, and we're already seeing that happen. Last night, there was a young person sitting near the front who had this past week been hospitalized and been in a traffic accident while on drugs. And they decided last night to get some treatment. And it may be time for you to be set free, and we believe that freedom is possible, hope is possible, and we want to help you get there. So let's start with a definition of addiction. Here's how addiction is classically defined. Addiction is when someone obsessively thinks about and compulsively uses drugs or alcohol despite the negative consequences. That's a good definition. Here's a shorter, perhaps more memorable definition. This will be our working definition for this series. Addiction is running back to what hurts you for help. It's running back to what hurts you for help. And we do this all the time. We run toward things that we think will help us. They end up hurting us, but then we run back to them time and time again. That is addiction. I was thinking about this a couple of months ago. I was on an airline flight. And I've flown enough times now that I don't typically listen to the flight attendants when they do their speech at the beginning and the end. I've kind of heard it a number of times. Don't be offended if you're a flight attendant. I just kind of tune you out. But on this particular flight, I guess I was really bored because I was listening. And this one was at the end of the flight. And the flight attendant said, we're making our approach. Please put your seat backs in a full upright position. Please stow away your tray tables. And a flight attendant will be coming through the cabin to pick up any unwanted garbage. And maybe I was just bored, maybe I was overthinking this, but that phrase, it just caught my attention, unwanted garbage. Unwanted garbage, I thought. Is there any such thing as wanted garbage? And like God can speak to you in the most mysterious ways, and I'm sitting there thinking to myself, unwanted. Is there wanted garbage? It's almost as if God said to me, yes, there is. In fact, you have some in your own life, Mark, things that you hold on to that you should throw away. Things that you run to that could eventually hurt you. That's what addiction is. It's running back to what hurts you, the wanted garbage in your life for help. And I want to perhaps expand our understanding a little bit of addiction, because I don't want you to tune me out, because oftentimes when we think of addiction, we think only of drugs and alcohol, and certainly those are some of the most powerful and damaging addictions. I don't believe they're the only ones. I've worked with people long enough to know that we all have something that we are drawn toward, something that we have to fight in our lives. And there are many things that we can develop addictions to. For instance, I think some people are addicted to food. You can become addicted to food, where you eat in order to make yourself feel better, to deal with the stress and the sadness in your life. But then you do that and you become unhealthy, or you become overweight, and so you feel terrible about yourself, and you want to deal with how you feel, so you go back to the food to make yourself feel better. Same cycle. Some people try to make themselves feel better by shopping, and buying and shopping can become addictive, but then you get the credit card bill and you feel terrible about how bad your finances are, and you feel the stress, and you got to relieve the stress. So what do? You go shopping. You know, technology can become addictive. Most of us know people that if we were to describe them, we would say they're addicted to their cell phone or addicted to their Xbox. And you feel lonely and you feel isolated and you want to escape the pain of your isolation and loneliness. So what do? You go on your phone. And it makes you feel more lonely and more isolated. See, it's this circular thing where addiction is running back to what hurts you for help. And I'll tell you something, it's really easy to be critical of somebody else's addiction and to be completely blind to your own, isn't it? For example, you don't use drugs. Or maybe you do. If you do, I'm glad you're here. But you don't use drugs, and you think to yourself, how could those people do that to themselves? But then you think nothing of going on Amazon and charging $140 on an almost maxed out credit card to buy more crap to put in your house that's already overflowing with stuff that you don't use, and they have an addiction. See, we can be so blind to our own and so critical of everyone else's. Here's what we got to understand. We're all in this together. We really are. We're all fighting something. We're all drawn towards something. So we're going to talk about this today, but we're not going to just talk about this in our weekend services, because we know this is a much deeper subject than we can tackle in 30 or 35 minutes on a Sunday. So let me tell you about a couple of resources. This afternoon at 2 o'clock, we're going to have a live conversation on Facebook with Rob Norris. You saw him on video a few minutes ago. He attends our Clark Summit campus, and he is the vice president of Summit Behavioral Health, which has addiction treatment centers in 12 states here in the Northeast. He's an expert on the subject, but this isn't just something he does for a living. This is something he lived. For about 10 years of his life, he was heavily addicted. Eventually, he was able to break free, and he's gained some victory in that struggle. Now he helps other people. And so you'll have a chance to interact, ask your questions this afternoon, 2 o'clock on our Facebook page. We're going to be live. Love to have you join the conversation. Also, on your way out today, at the Next Steps area, you can pick up this sheet of paper with some other resources, things that you can read, support groups that you can become a part of, or that you can become a part of if you have a family member who's struggling with addiction. So take advantage of those things. Okay, so for today, as we begin this series, I want to talk specifically about one aspect of addiction. I want to talk today about the pathway to addiction. I want to talk about how we get there and what keeps us there. It's important to understand this so that you can identify when you may be on this pathway and do something to get off this pathway. And here's what we all need to understand to start with. We don't plan our way into addiction. We drift our way into it. Like, nobody gets there intentionally. Nobody wakes up one day and says, you know what, I think I'll have a cigarette today, and if all goes according to plan, I'll have lung cancer by the time I'm 65 and die by the time I'm 70. Nobody does that. Nobody wakes up and says, I think I'll go to Mohegan Sun Casino today and play a slot machine, and hopefully that will lead me to the point where I blow through my retirement account, use up my kids' college fund, maybe even have my car repossessed. Let's see if the plan works out. Nobody thinks that way. Nobody says, I think I'll have a beer today, and if things go according to plan, I'll become an alcoholic, and I'll blow up my family, and my kids will never speak to me again, and I'll die at an early age. Like, nobody thinks that way. Nobody plans that way, because we don't plan our way into addiction. We drift into it, because millions of people find themselves there. And they get there one step at a time, one decision at a time, one day at a time, one choice at a time. We drift there. Let me kind of illustrate this for you. I'll talk about one of my temptations. One of my temptations is chocolate. Yes. It's not my only temptation, but it's the only one I'll talk about in church, okay? So I love chocolate. So when I was in college, when I was a freshman, my mom sent me a care package, and in the care package was one of these. This is a 5-pound Hershey's milk chocolate candy bar. Can I get an amen? Yes. Hallelujah. God created this. Love chocolate. Okay, but here's the thing. I would never eat that. There are 11,400 calories in that thing, 720 fat grams. That thing is so unhealthy. I would never buy one of those except for a sermon illustration. I would never eat that. Never, ever. But you know what I will do? I'll eat these. These are Hershey's Kisses. And they're small. They're shiny. They're tiny. Like, I'll eat those. In fact, one of our staff members has a basket on her desk. It always has candy in it so that if any staff member just needs a snack in the middle of the day, there's candy there for them because we take good care of our staff here at Parker Hill. And if I walk by and there's Skittles in there, no big deal. Peanut butter cups, I can walk by. Man, if there's Hershey's Kisses in there, I reroute my path to the men's room to go buy the basket because I love Hershey's Kisses. And if I'm having a stressful day, I'm not lying about this, I can eat 30 of those in one day. If I'm having a stressful week, I could eat that whole bowl right there, okay? This, as opposed to having 11,000 calories, this has 15,000 and 900 some fat grams. But see, here's how I justify it. That's just one. And they're so small. Like, it's just Hershey's Kisses, and you can deceive yourself, and you can eat an entire bowl of Hershey's Kisses even though you say you will never eat this. That's how addiction works. I would never end up there. But it's just one drink. It's just one decision. It's just one choice. It's just one day. See, it's not something we plan our way into. It's something that we drift our way into. And so I want to talk specifically today about that addiction pathway, what it looks like, so that if we find ourselves on it, we can get ourselves off of it with some help. So addiction, I believe, always begins with pain. There's some kind of pain in life that we are trying to deal with. Maybe it's emotional pain, sometimes physical pain, relational pain, but there's something troubling us, and we don't like the feeling of that trouble. So in order to deal with the pain, we move toward desire. In other words, we try to satisfy some physical desire, some physical pleasure, because for a while it drowns out the pain and makes us forget about it. But if we do that long enough, eventually we move into the realm of deception, meaning this, that we deceive ourselves and we say, it's no big deal, I can handle this, it's not a problem for me. I can stop at any time. It's kind of like Mark Twain. Mark Twain famously said something when someone challenged him to quit smoking. He said this, he said, quitting smoking is easy. I've done it hundreds of times. So people say, it's no big deal, I can quit anytime. You're deceived. That deception, if lived in long enough, leads to compulsion. That's where you're no longer just making a choice. Now you're being pushed to do this. And if you live in that compulsive state long enough, it will bring destruction into your life. Financial destruction, relationship destruction, destruction of your health. And do you know what all of that creates? Pain. And do you know how you deal with the pain that is now compounded? You try to escape from it by fulfilling some desire. And this path is not linear. It becomes a circular path. It gets well-worn and becomes a downward spiral. Nobody plans for addiction, but we drift into it and we find ourselves on a path that we can't get ourselves off of. And it's important to understand the path so you understand maybe when you're on that path so that you can get off of that path. Okay, I want to talk about that path today. And around here at Parker Hill, whenever we do these weekend messages, we always make reference to the Bible because we believe that God has communicated to us in a timeless way in the pages of Scripture. So today I want to show you a passage from a part of the Bible in what we call the New Testament. It was a letter written by James. James was the brother of Jesus. He was the key leader in the church in Jerusalem. And James wrote this letter to Christians in the first century, and we call it very creatively the book of James. Isn't that creative? And it's not a book, actually, it's a letter. And he never uses the word addiction. The word addiction isn't in the Bible. The word didn't exist 2,000 years ago. But James gives this fascinatingly accurate description of the pathway to addiction. Let me just read through these 6 verses, and then we'll talk about them a little bit. Here's what he wrote. Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, because having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him. When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone, but each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. Then, after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. Don't be deceived, my dear brothers and sisters. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. Now, let me walk you back through that and point out the pathway to addiction. Addiction always begins with pain. And in verse 12, James wrote this, blessed is the one who perseveres under trial. In fact, if you were to go back and read the entire context, you would discover that the very first 12 verses at the beginning of this letter were all about suffering and trials and pain. And then he said, blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, gets through with that thought, and then he begins this way, when tempted. There's a very intentional flow of thought here. James talks about suffering, then he immediately talks about temptation for this reason. The time when we are most susceptible to temptation is when we're dealing with some kind of pain. And if you could trace it all the way back, I believe almost every addiction begins with some sort of pain. Now, one area where that's obvious is physical pain. You know, you go to a doctor to treat an injury, to get surgery, you need some pain medication, you get addicted to it. That's the obvious one. That's not the most common one. The most common source of pain is emotional pain. You have some kind of emotional trauma. There's something that wounds you deeply inside. And so you reach out for something to deal with that pain, to stop the circus in your brain, to stop the hurt in your heart. You reach out for something just to feel better for a little while and eventually become addicted to it, whatever it is. And that's why I believe we ought to have compassion and not judgment for people who are struggling with addiction. We ought to recognize that if we could trace that all the way back, if we knew their personal history, we would probably discover that their addiction began at some point with some pain. And we ought to have some compassion for them. So that pain, then, as I said, leads to desire. When tempted, James says, and by the way, he didn't say if, because it's not if. It's only a matter of when in this broken world. Temptation is inevitable for all of us. And by the way, this was written 2,000 years ago, before there were shopping malls, before there were bars, casinos, the internet. If temptation was inevitable back then, it is certainly inevitable now. It's waiting for you right outside that door or in your hand as you hold your phone right now, not listening to me. It's not if, it's when. That ought to humble you. Every single one of us is only a few steps away from addiction. When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me, because we all look for people to blame. It's not my fault. I grew up in this family. I had these circumstances, just the way I'm wired. No. Take ownership. God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil, what's the word there? Desire. You got to notice that word, but not just that word. You got to notice the word that comes right before it. The word that comes right before it is the word evil. Here's what you have to understand. Desire in and of itself is not wrong. It is not evil. Desire, in fact, is good. God is pro-desire. God created our desires. He created us with a desire to feel pleasure, to feel joy, to laugh. He created us with a desire to eat and drink. He created us with a desire for sexual connection. All of that is God-given. Those are God-given good desires. But at some point, that all shifts, and a good desire can become an evil desire. When does an good desire become an evil desire? Here's when. When we begin to look to that desire to fill an emptiness inside that only God can fill. A good desire becomes an evil desire when that desire takes the place of God. See, when a good thing becomes a God thing, then it becomes a bad thing, because then that is what we truly worship. You know, like God gives us a desire for food. That's good. If we didn't have a desire for food, we would starve to death. Obviously, it's a God-given desire. But then sometimes we pursue food not just for nourishment, but we pursue it as a coping mechanism, right? So you drown your sadness and your sorrows in a half gallon of chocolate ice cream. I don't know if you do. I do, I should say. And we call that stress eating, or we call that comfort food. Because we're now seeking our comfort not from God, but from food. Or you're feeling sad, so you go to the shopping mall. Or in my case, you go to Home Depot. And you buy something, and the act of buying something makes you feel a little bit more in control, right? I walked in, I purchased this, I'm taking it home. I now have a new thing, and it's shiny, and it smells good. I feel better about myself. And suddenly that desire to acquire and manage earthly things, that desire has somehow replaced God in our lives. A desire becomes an evil desire when that desire takes the place of God himself. When a good thing becomes a God thing, it then becomes a bad thing for us. And let me tell you something. Here's an observation I've made. I think every addiction is a gateway addiction. Because when you begin to turn to one thing to rescue you, pretty soon you're turning to a lot of other things to rescue you as well. And now you have all these false saviors, these things that you are turning to for help that will ultimately hurt you. So pain drives us, if we're not careful, toward unhealthy desire to soothe that pain, to deal with that pain. And in the midst of doing this, deception begins to set in, because whenever there's addiction, it's always surrounded by deception, right? We deceive ourselves. It's no big deal. I can handle this. I don't have a problem. We deceive other people. We don't tell them where we're going or where the money's being spent. But do you know what the worst deception is? The fact that we are being deceived by the temptation itself. That our eyes somehow become blind by desire to the point where we get deceived. It says each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desires and enticed. That word enticed, it's a very interesting word. And in the first century, the book of James, the letter from James, was originally written in the Greek language. And in the Greek language, the word enticed was almost always used to describe the process of hunting or fishing. In fact, the word literally means this. It means to catch with bait. It's how temptation works. There's the lure of temptation that hides the hook of the consequences. We see the short-term pleasure, but we miss the long-term pain, and we are deceived by it. There was a reality show on TV a few years ago. It was called Bait Car. Very interesting concept. This is a crime prevention idea that's used by police departments in major cities. And so what the police department will do is they'll purchase what they call a bait car. And it's called that because it's a very desirable model of car that car thieves would be drawn to. And then they take the bait car and they park it in a high crime area, and get this, sometimes even leave the keys in the ignition. I mean, you almost feel sorry for the criminal at that point, but anyway, they leave the keys in the ignition, and so then the car gets stolen. But listen, the bait car is equipped with very sophisticated GPS tracking and a video camera on the inside so they can prosecute it in court a little bit easier. But the best part of the bait car is that it has this remote control system that stalls the engine and locks all four doors. Like, you do not have a prayer if you step into the bait car. It's based on deception. It's enticing with bait. That's not a new strategy, by the way. The enemy of your soul has been using that strategy for thousands of years. We are so caught up in the lure of that thing that will calm our pain that we don't see the consequences. Just like the guy stealing the car, I think they were just getting a nice ride. They were getting a ride to the police station is what they were getting. And we don't see the consequences because we become blinded by deception. Pain leads us to satisfy that pain through desire. That desire begins to deceive us, and we end up at this point on that pathway, compulsion. Compulsion, meaning you no longer just choose it. It begins to demand that you choose it. And James continues to write here, and he uses this fascinating word picture, this fascinating metaphor of childbirth. I'll call it fascinating because I've never had to do it, but it's a powerful metaphor. Then he says, after desire has conceived, in other words, desire gives birth to sin. You act in such a way that you do something that you know is taking you further from God, not toward God. You do something He would not want you to do. That gives birth to sin. And then sin, when it is full grown, in other words, when this becomes fully developed and ingrained in you, it's the metaphor of a child. And if you've ever raised any kids, you know your kids get to a point eventually where you can no longer control them. And if you have a son, he gets big enough that he can actually overpower you. This thing that you gave birth to can control you. That's the picture of the metaphor here. You get to this point of compulsion. You physically and psychologically, your brain gets rewired. And you begin to think and respond differently. And suddenly, you're no longer choosing this addiction. It is choosing you. It is forcing you. This is the classic definition of addiction. You have no control. It has control over you. And do you know when it has control over you? When it calls, you come. Even when God says no. That's how you know you're at this stage on the pathway. When it calls, you come, even when God says no. So it begins with pain, leads to desire. We become deceived. We find ourselves in a state where it's compulsive, and then eventually it leads us to the point of destruction. Then after desire is conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. And when the Bible uses the word death, that does not always mean physical, literal death. It can mean that. And in this discussion, for many people, it does mean that. Like I said, last year there were more people who died in drug overdoses than in 3 wars that we fought. Sometimes it's literal death. But sometimes it's the death of your marriage. Sometimes it's the death of your reputation. It can be the death of your finances, the death of your relationship with your kids. Sometimes it's the death of a heart that is so covered in shame that you feel worthless. Death is the end result. Let me go back to this path again, just so we can see it. Pain drives us to desire to satisfy or to quench that pain. That desire lived in long enough begins to deceive us until we're forced to pursue this by compulsion, and we end up being destroyed by it, which brings us right back around to a place of even greater pain now because of all the consequences we've created, and the only way to escape, we think, is back to that same thing. Now, here's the thing. Most of us already know this, right? Like, this is not new information. Some of you have experienced this, but many of us have seen this in the life of another person. But here's the problem. We think to ourselves, we get on this path, we think, yeah, that's true, but that doesn't apply to me because I'm smarter and I'm stronger and I'm slicker. But it does. That's why James says this in verse 16. He gives this warning, don't be deceived. Don't be deceived, my dear brothers and sisters. Don't think this isn't you someday or couldn't be you someday. A few weeks ago, I mentioned a book that I have in my office. It's called A View from the Zoo. It's written by Gary Richmond. Gary Richmond was the Los Angeles zookeeper for a number of years and eventually became a pastor. And so he wrote this book where he takes everything he learned as a zookeeper and applies it to spiritual lessons. And in one chapter, he writes about his next door neighbor, a teenage girl by the name of Julie, who brought home a raccoon as a pet named Bandit. Here's what he wrote. Bandit was irresistible. When my neighbor Julie bought him at the pet store, she was sure they would be lifelong friends. Everywhere she went, he went, usually perched on her shoulder. Bandit's habit of holding Julie's cheeks in his paws and looking into her eyes with sparkling curiosity always melted her and solicited an affectionate kiss and hug. Can we all say aw? Aw. And he grew. 18 months passed, and Bandit became a strapping 25-pound adolescent raccoon. He still loved affection, rode on shoulders, and seemed to be proof that raccoons make great pets. I mentioned Julie and Bandit to our zoo veterinarian one day and inquired as to why more people didn't keep raccoons as pets. His answer floored me. They undergo a glandular change at about 24 months. After that, they become unpredictable, independent, and often attack their owners. Since a 30-pound raccoon can be equal to a 100-pound dog in a fight, I felt compelled to mention the coming change to Julie. She sat and listened politely as I explained what an eminent world authority had shared with me concerning raccoons and their nature. I'll never forget her answer. "It will be different for me." And she smiled as she added, "Bandit wouldn't hurt me. He just wouldn't." 3 months later, Julie underwent plastic surgery for facial lacerations sustained when her adult raccoon attacked her for no apparent reason, and Bandit was released into the wild. Temptation comes to us, disguised as something harmless and affectionate, and we make it our pet. We become attached to it, and we say, "It'll be different for me. It will be different for me." And James says, no. Don't be deceived. Don't be deceived, my brothers and sisters. There is a path, and this is what the path looks like. And you got to know the path so you can know when you're on it and get off the path. And here's the thing. The earlier you recognize you're on this path, the easier it is to get off this path. The farther you get down this path, the harder it is to break away from it. Thomas à Kempis was a church leader back in the 1400s, and he wrote something in a book called The Imitation of Christ that hits the point so well. It's a little bit outdated in terms of its wording, but it's a very powerful idea. He says, "We need especially to be on our guard at the very onset of temptation, for then the enemy may be more easily overcome. He must be repelled at the threshold as soon as he knocks. And the longer a man delays resistance, the weaker he becomes, and the stronger his enemy grows against him." So here's my question. What's the Hershey's Kiss in your life? What's that thing that you look at and you say, it's pretty small, and it's really shiny. It's just one. I mean, like, I would never do that, never eat that, but it's just this one thing. Because, see, we never plan our way into addiction. We drift our way into it. So how do you keep from drifting? And what do you do once you find yourself deep into the grip of it? I think the answer is the same. You got to look up. You got to look up. Like Rob said earlier, the ultimate hope is not a pill or a drug. It's not a drink. The only thing that will fill the emptiness in your heart, and the only thing that will give you the power to live the way that you should, is to have an authentic relationship with your Father in heaven. That's why James concludes this way. He says, "Listen, every good and perfect gift, not these things that destroy you, every good and perfect gift, everything that will bring life and blessing to you is from," where is it from? It's from above. It's not the stuff of this world. Coming down from the Father, the God who loves you and wants to help you as his child, if you're a follower of Christ, to live in a way that will protect you from harm, coming down from the Father who does not change like shifting shadows. Like every temptation and every addiction is a shifting shadow. It looks so good, it feels so good, but then it hits so hard and destroys so bad. The only way out is to look above. That's why if you've ever been in addiction recovery and you've been involved in the 12 steps, you know step number 2 says this: we came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. That's the answer. Here's the challenge. When you find yourself in the grip of a habit or addiction, sometimes the last person that you want to talk to is God, because you feel so much shame and you feel so dirty and you've let him down so many times. Let me tell you about the heart of a good father. The heart of a good father is, I don't care how many times you fall. I just want you to come to me. I want you to get back up because I love you and I want to help you succeed. Because at the heart of every addiction is a God issue. It's not about breaking habits. In fact, part of the biggest issue is our conception of God. And if you grow up in a very legalistic religion or a church with a lot of rules, you feel this way: I messed up. My dad is going to kill me. Maybe you had a dad like that too, I don't know. But really, you should be thinking this way: I messed up, I need to call my dad. That's the way out. You look up to the Father who will give you every good gift, who does not change like shifting shadows. So I'm going to have the band come on back up. We're going to put an exclamation point on the end of this service with a song that declares the freedom that we can have. Reminder, there's some resources out there at the Next Steps area. If you need some more help, we'll be on Facebook Live this afternoon. But I know this, I know statistically in a room of this size, there are people here today who struggle with an addiction of some kind. It may be a chemical, it may be a drug, maybe something else. Maybe nobody knows about it. You've kept it hidden for years, but you know. And it calls out to you, and you feel like a slave. I want you to know there's a God in heaven who wants to take you out of that slavery and part the seas of addiction and help you to find your way home. And he can do that. As the band sets up, watch this with me.